If you're not already subscribed to this YouTube channel, go ahead and hit the subscribe button now, along with the bell icon so you can be notified whenever a new video is posted. And if you're already subscribed, check and make sure that YouTube hasn't unsubscribed you. And of course, be sure to give the video a like as well as share it on your social media. The white supremacists hate that. And now, the Sunday address. This is by no means comprehensive, but we're going to hit some of the highlights and lowlifes of the year that was 2024. The year started off a lot like how it ended. Biden and the DNC were making their clumsy overtures to black men in particular. In fact, this would be a constant theme for the entire year. Biden was clearly struggling with black male support at the end of 2023, and the Democrats' solution was to give lip service and empty gestures, which the Democrats would continue to do up until Biden was forced to drop out of the race and Kamala Harris started her own campaign. Democrats tried to claim they had a plan just for black men, but of course it was nothing more than a few snippets and excerpts from Kamala Harris's general raft of empty campaign promises. Her surrogates like Wendell Pierce openly admitted that if black men were eligible to apply for this or that program, then that made it just for black men, even though it's actually for everyone. But when they realized that black men weren't going to go along with the okie doke, they dropped all the phony niceties and began nothing but straight abuse, bringing in bootlicks and sellouts to insult and scold black men like Steph Curry, Magic Johnson, even Spike Lee had to get in on the act, and he's going to spend the rest of his career trying to live this mistake down, assuming that we ever let him. And of course, the scolder-in-chief Barack Obama and his shrew wife had to make it a point to tell black men how disappointed they are in us. But quiet as it's kept, while black men had turned their backs on the Democrats, a growing number of black women had done the same. And that factor was one that the Democrats had been telling themselves that they could just ignore out of existence, only they couldn't. I can only imagine how they felt on Election Day when they saw the black voter turnout, or should I say when they didn't see the black voter turnout. Cat Williams set the internet on fire. I don't listen to or watch Shannon Sharpe's podcast, and to be brutally honest, I don't recommend it either. But I do think the Cat Williams interview was significant in that it showed black people in the podcast space can and should make a huge impact and be leading the social discourse, and not outsourcing our voice to other people outside the community. For a few weeks, Joe Racist Rogan wasn't the biggest thing in podcasting, and to me, that alone makes this noteworthy. The mega success of the Cat Williams interview proved that we don't have to let these little scumbags like Vlad do what we're supposed to be doing for ourselves. Sadly, we have spent decades teaching everyone that they can just come into our spaces, invited or not, and we'll still patronize them anyway at the expense of our own. What the success of this interview showed is that we can not only reverse this catastrophic trend, but we can take things in the right direction hard and lead the discussion. For those folks who don't listen so well, this is not an endorsement of Shannon Sharpe's podcast, but it is an acknowledgement that black people can make podcasting a bulwark instead of an outhouse, if we want to. Jonathan Majors went from rising star to falling star overnight. His Becky broke bad on him, and before he knew it, he went from being chased halfway across New York to being railroaded into a conviction for, well, I'm not exactly sure what he was convicted of, and neither is anyone else. He lost a lot of acting gigs and endorsements, and worst of all, his job working for Marvel Studios. But Majors is a smart guy, and I predicted that he would land on his feet. First thing he did was to upgrade his taste in love interest, and within a few months it was announced that he had landed another acting role, and one of his movies that had gotten axed would be released after all. This was all a phony controversy, a nothing burger, and had Jonathan Majors been white, but of course he's not white, and that's the entire point. Ron DeSantis' fraud of a presidential campaign finally went belly up. He was never really a contender to begin with, and his brilliant strategy of running against black people went belly up too. The king, or rather court jester of being anti-woke, saw his presidential dreams go to sleep. See what I did there? DeSantis is an idiot, and if he had any brains, he would actually have made his entire administration all about addressing the real concerns of Floridians. Principally building as many affordable homes in Florida as possible and addressing the state's out-of-control insurance catastrophe. The white supremacists in the Florida legislature gave this clown the ability to arbitrarily remove from office any elected official in the state, which ought to be blatantly unconstitutional, but we live under white supremacy, not the rule of law. Of all the governors in America, DeSantis is in a prime position where he could force county commissions, zoning boards, and other municipal officials to enact rules that would be conducive to compelling them to finally build more single-family dwellings, which is what the housing crisis is ultimately about. But of course, DeSantis would never do that, for the same reason Kamala Harris and Gavin Newsom refused to do anything in California, which was patient zero for the housing crisis, because they're all literally on the payroll of these real estate developers and the big hedge funds like Blackstone and BlackRock, who make their money off of creating artificial scarcity in the housing market, which they then leverage to rape the economy for real profits. DeSantis could have run on something substantive, but since when does a clown stop a circus? Just like Rick Snyder in Michigan, who also had dictatorial control of the state through a GOP-controlled legislature and then lost it all, DeSantis has lost his pathetic pretend presidential run and his political future. Or has he? Now his only remaining hope of having life after political death is if Trump is generous or careless enough to put a never-Trumper in his administration. But considering how many people the Orange Man has antagonized over the last 10 years, he may be forced to do exactly that. It's not like he's got a lot of friends left. And Dumb Santis's would-be Machiavelli, Chris Rufo, has been trying to see if there's any other red state racist who he can get to hire him. His quote-unquote blueprint for a GOP takeover of America turned out to be a blueprint for how to galvanize your opponents instead. Those school boards that they thought they had taken over were taken back in quick order. Everyone who tried to echo DeSantis' talking points turned themselves into political lightning rods. DeSantis' own asinine message legislation like the Stop Woke Act were all easily overturned, and the only thing he's known for is cheerleading for educational policy that says slavery was a benefit. He became the epitome of a do-nothing administration, but it says a lot about the Democrats that they weren't able to beat him, but truth be told, they weren't trying. Quiet as it's kept, Democrats see real advantages in having mouth-frothing racists like DeSantis in office because, as Democrats see it, blatant white supremacists like him are supposed to scare black voters to the polls so that we'll vote for the Democrats even while the Democrats tell us to our faces they're not going to do anything for us. And for a century, they've been right. It never occurred to them, though, that this could ever change, but as we'll discuss later on, 2024 would be a year full of surprises. The war in Gaza finally saw Israel brought before the UN, but it wasn't an Arab state that did it, but an African one. While I like seeing black people anywhere who are stepping forward and taking charge, I can't really co-sign what the South Africans did because the reality is that the South Africans care about the plight of Arabs in the Middle East and could care less about the plight of other black people in the U.S. The U.S. should be brought before the International Court of Justice and the UN, but as I've explained numerous times, the U.S. is not a signatory to the ICJ or the International Criminal Court, and as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, the U.S. can veto any attempt to hold it accountable for its genocidal actions against black Americans, or for its supporting genocide abroad. Obviously, seeing Africans pull such a historic move against a white country scared the white powers that be in the U.S., so a plan was hatched to pretend to support making not one but two African countries into quote-unquote permanent members of the Security Council, except the U.S. demanded that these two African admissions not have veto power, which is what being on the Security Council is all about. And when asked why the African countries should be the only ones on the Security Council without veto power, UN Ambassador Greenfield said it would make the Security Council's work dysfunctional. Now, the U.S. has veto power, and hasn't that made the Security Council an utter basket case? And of course, by using wording like that, dysfunctional, it's intentionally meant to be a dog whistle that these Africans are simply too backwards to be in a position to influence policy. They need to just sit at the table and listen to their superiors. This is blatant, open colonizer talk being done in front of the world about African nations. And notice that they had a black woman sell the soap on this one. Gee, if you didn't know better, you'd swear this was the real reason Biden was trumpeting having these black front women in his administration in the first place, to be his crash dummies for moments like this. This was an attempt to find two puppet states over there who these white supremacists have their hooks into. Kenya would almost certainly be one of them. And then put these puppet regimes on the UN Security Council where they would do like the so-called Palestinian Authority did with the genocide in Gaza and just sit on their hands while the white global powers do the same old same-o. The African countries balked at this blatant insult, but the real question is, when are they going to wise up and realize that as long as they refuse to support, fund, and promote the interest of black Americans, they will continue to be insulted by these white powers that they want to be so chummy with. They will continue to be treated as the third world. This is willful refusal to accept reality, and that's what put Africa on its knees. And Africa is tether central, not just for the ones it sends over here, but because they're full and overflowing with tethers over there. It will be impossible for Africans to influence policy in the U.S. by using tethers, sellouts, and cowards who ran away from home. They need black people with backbone. If they're going to do that, they need FBAs to do that. For them to continue refusing to accept this fact is no different than a criminal defendant with no law degree going into court and trying to represent himself at his own murder trial. As the old lawyer saying goes, he who represents himself has a fool for a client. This is warfare, and part of warfare is undermining your enemy. Trying to be internationalist simply won't work for Africa. Sticking up for Palestine or any of their other pet issues is never going to be a substitute for the failure to have black American solidarity. Africans want to be influential. Common sense would dictate that they start with the people who are most trustworthy and most willing to actually help them. But as we've seen, the same stubborn foolishness that brought Africa to the sorry state it's in today persists to the present. So they'll be heroes to the international movements that they fell in love with in the 60s. But other than gestures like the one at the ICJ, they won't be getting much done. Neither South Africa's genocide case before the ICJ nor the international criminal indictment of Benjamin Netanyahu has done anything to stop Israel's rampage. In fact, the Israelis have only intensified it. And now the Israelis have toppled one of the Palestinians' two main supporters, Syria. This has emboldened the Netanyahu regime to take more territory and to start eyeing Iran, which is Palestine's last remaining supporter to be toppled next. If the U.S. cut Israel off, their war machine would grind to a halt in days, not months. The Israelis themselves have admitted this. And this is why AIPAC made it their number one priority to target black American congresspeople who refuse to wave the flag for Israel. Were African countries concerned about supporting these black politicians? Of course not. So how serious are they about supporting Palestine then? Not very. They chose the wrong place to stand and the wrong people to stand with. Niger has gotten tough with the U.S., at least rhetorically, but they also have failed to reach out to black Americans. The government in Niger is not pursuing an actual strategy. They're opting for tactics, and when dealing with a sophisticated enemy, that won't work. The Africans have yet to learn that an incomplete strategy will lead to complete disaster. The white supremacists are playing chess. The Africans continue to play tic-tac-toe, and we see which ones are winning. Don Lemon, fresh off getting the boot from CNN, announced that he would have a show on Twitter. Nobody's going to call it X. And no sooner than he did that than he decided to give Elon Musk some direct questions during an interview, and he immediately announced that his would-be show on Twitter was canceled. Before it even began, grand opening followed by the grand closing. But Don Lemonade's not the only cable news cast-off who's been desperately trying to find a second career online, but he's finding out, like the rest of them, that all their years and even decades of sucking up to white media has made them radioactive online. Seems the masses, especially the under 50 crowd, aren't as dumb as these bootlicks thought they were. California has been ground zero in the fight for reparations. Earlier this year, as the state got ever closer to actually having to impanel a Freedmen's Bureau, we saw the so-called Black Legislative Caucus out there reveal themselves to be the backstabbing sellouts the black media always said they were. From the outset, you had shills and bootlicks pushing any and every do-nothing gesture and policy they could in place of reparations, everything from hair legislation to an apology for LGBT folks, anything but cash reparations. The final nail in the NAACP's coffin was driven home when they were forced to openly, publicly oppose cash reparations, and when they got called out on it, they tried to slither away from that move, but then their white paymasters told them to get back out there and sell the soap, so they had to backtrack on their backtracking. Pathetic. This was an organized offense we were up against, and this was the plan from the very start. We had put the bastards on the spot. White power told them they better get out there and earn their butter biscuits, and this was what they did. And this summer we saw them exposed in front of the world to the point that Governor Newsom himself had to show that he had been pulling the strings all along, a white puppet master manipulating his black tools. The issue had never gotten this far before because up until now we had these same shills and bootlicks who have been out here in politics since time immemorial claiming that they were pushing the issue. All these black politicians all these decades saying, oh, we in there fighting for yous. But as we've seen, they were actually pushing nothing. Now they're pushing against us. The black grassroots have taken charge, and we see what side these sellouts have always been on. The survivors of the Tulsa Race Massacre have been demanding reparations, but instead Democrats have helped to push the idea that a monument would be better. Make no mistake, when you see these monuments and markers talking about this or that race massacre or atrocity against black people, while they are historically significant, understand that under white supremacy, these are actually monuments to the crimes that these bastards have gotten away with. Because that's how the enemy sees it. The only proper monument to the survivors of the American Holocaust is to strip the beneficiaries of white supremacy of their ill-gotten gains. Now let's get this straight. There's no quick and easy path to toppling white supremacy. A system that has entrenched itself for hundreds of years isn't going to fall in a single day. The enemy is unscrupulous, so we must be relentless. The enemy may have us outnumbered and outfinanced, but we've got them outclassed. The fight has only just started, but as I've always told you, if we fight, we win. Nigga Jim Clyburn, America's favorite sharecropper, was whining 4 years ago after Democrats won the presidency and both houses of Congress due to young black people being politically mobilized. Well, he and his white DNC paymasters didn't like that young people were bringing pressure to finally punish the police in 2020. Those young people he was griping about, they were the only reason the Democrats had a clean sweep of the government 4 years ago. Without them, Democrats would have lost easily, like they did this year. Clyburn was looking for a scapegoat, though, for why his own hand-picked shill, Jamie Harrison, lost his Senate race, and rather than blame his poor choice of candidate, he instead decided that those young activists would be the distraction du jour. Well, Jamie Harrison was made DNC chairman after his political defeat, and now this year, Democrats have lost everything, the House, the Senate, and the presidency. You see, Clyburn's boy Harrison has been in charge of things. The young black people that Clyburn was whining about, they weren't in the streets this year, and they weren't in the voting booths either. These old civil rights retreads and baby boomer fossils are burning out. They've lived long enough to see themselves get what they deserve, to be ignored. The goal of the Jim Clyburns is to copy their white counterparts and use government like some family heirloom passed down from father to child. It's no accident that these CBC clowns all represent the poorest areas in America, and you see with leadership like this why that is. They'll ensure that their own children get taken care of while yours are in the streets. But it seems keeping us on that treadmill isn't going to be as easy as these bootlicks thought. And 2024 wasn't just the year that the bootlick economy fell apart for the DNC shills. It was also the year that the black puppets on the white right got shown the door too. Daniel Cameron used his position to mislead a grand jury into not indicting the murderers of Breonna Taylor. He thought that he would become governor of Kentucky literally over a black woman's dead body. And when he ran for governor last year, those racist rubes out there that he was counting on getting the votes from, they stayed home. A Democrat won the governor's race easily. See, those racist right-wingers would much rather see a white man as governor before a bootlicking black male, and so Cameron is now trying to reinvent himself as an anti-diversity activist. Imagine that. This fool, who in 90% of cases is the only black face in a room full of white folks, and he's talking about how he doesn't want diversity. Hey, the grift must go on, right? But he's not the only professional butt kisser on the white right who got his walking papers. The same thing went for Mark Robinson, the bloated buffoon out there in North Carolina. He's made a royal fool of himself for years now, even going so far as to say black Americans should pay America reparations for slavery. Apparently, the clown never read a history book, or he'd know the U.S. actually did pay reparations, quote-unquote, to slave owners after slavery. So the criminals were rewarded for their crimes is what happened. And who could forget how Candace Owens, the queen of the bootlicks, got canned by the Daily Wire after she dared to criticize Israel? Ben Shapiro claims to be America first, but when it comes to Israel, he's Tel Aviv first and only. And we saw what the white right considers to be the limits of free speech, which is when you dare to disagree with them. These are the same racists who claim that everything must be sayable, especially if you're saying it about black people. That people can be just so hypersensitive to words. Why does everyone have to be so sensitive? We have to be grown-ups and be willing to confront ideas, even ones we don't want to hear. But Candace Owens merely whispered that there may be something wrong with the Israeli lobby and its supporters, and that was enough for them to throw her out, and all of her prior cheerleaders like David Horowitz denounced her and claimed that this shill, who they previously praised for being so brilliant, well, now she was suddenly no better than any other dumb black person. And Candace Owens, while no smarter than she was before, is, however, having to eat crow. Obviously, we don't respect her because she's not respect-worthy, but it is interesting to see that she took a stand that she knew her white paymasters wouldn't like, and the results were totally predictable. So, will she now call out the white right as being the home of intolerance and intellectual censorship? Probably not. So I guess Cat Williams was right. 2024 would be a year when everyone who's a liar and a fraud would get exposed. But the shills, be they Democrat or Republicans, all play the same game of ignoring black interest, if not outright attacking black interest, and in the end, they all wind up begging some other white benefactor for a job. Just goes to show there's no cure for stupid. Harvey Weinstein's New York rape conviction was overturned. I mentioned that because there were shills who were celebrating when I predicted that Harvey Weinstein would beat the rap on this one, and it seemed for a while that I was wrong at first. But as one of the thought leaders for the black media, I make it a point to read the tea leaves so my people can be forewarned. Now, to be fair, I don't like entertainment, if I have to mention that for the umpteenth time. I've explained already why that is, and the fate of these Babbitt-like figures like Weinstein is irrelevant to black empowerment. Nothing that happens to him is going to impact us one iota. So as I've said before, his fate means nothing to us. But it is noteworthy in that he's a powerful white man who bumped elbows with tons of DC politicians, and as one of the white media's main myth makers, how he was dealt with would tell us more about his own personal power than it did anything else. So yes, Weinstein was convicted, and now it's been overturned. His white privilege took a little while to kick in, but it eventually did, and now a new trial has been ordered. Can prosecutors convict him a second time? I gotta tell you, people tend not to like sequels, make of that what you will. Hunter Biden was convicted in his gun trial, predictably, and although it was his own father's DOJ that charged and prosecuted him, his daddy claimed that it was all Trump's fault anyway. I tell you, dementia is a hell of a drug. And speaking of drugs, Hunter's own lifelong drug abuse made no difference to his father, who made a career out of openly demonizing black people about the selling and use of drugs. This is the racial double standard that creeps like Joe Biden have depended on for hundreds of years. If it wasn't for white privilege, Biden would be a wrinkled-up elderly crackhead under a bridge somewhere, and his son would be turning tricks for crack rocks right beside him. After decades of white supremacist misrule, the town of Newbern, Alabama, a majority black town, has taken its power, and all it took was one black man to take a stand. Nobody had actually even attempted to challenge the white power structure there. Your civil rights retreads and sellouts certainly never did it. Where have they been for the last 60 years while this was going on? Sucking up to white power. That's where they've been. Negro Jim Clyburn, he's been trying to figure out ways to make sure that his daughter gets ensconced in power just like him. They didn't have time to actually do anything for black folks. I hope that this new mayor in Newbern is not going to try to walk in the footsteps of trash like Montgomery Mayor Stephen Reed. Black people deserve actual leadership, not shills trying to make a career out of getting reelected. The first substantive step would be for the new mayor to start opening the financial records of Newbern and start putting cases on these white supremacists who have been misruling that place for so long. White supremacists cannot be made peace with, and they cannot be reformed either. They can only be punished. If he's serious about making change, he can change those white supremacists from being immune to the law to finally being subject to it. The white supremacists there knew that the racist white state government would back them up, so they simply declared for decades on end that they were just going to ignore elections and that they were in charge. Now, if this is how these white supremacists are acting over an admittedly small, politically insignificant place like Newbern, how do you think they'll react when you start throwing them out of power in a town that matters? P. Diddy has gone from a federal raid to what's shaping up to be a federal railroading. Now, for the slow folks, I'm no fan of Diddy, and I really don't care about him. But nothing happens in a vacuum under white supremacy. This sudden infatuation with him didn't come out of nowhere. The white media is making a big deal of him for their own interests, and those interests are to maintain the steady drumbeat of keeping a black face constantly in the headlines for this or that alleged misconduct or criminality. That's the white media's job, mind control through the relentless use of repetitive imagery. And now they've roped Jay-Z into all this. He's blown holes in his accuser's case and gotten the accuser to backtrack on much of it, but the judge is refusing to throw out the case anyway. Jay-Z loved to talk about chess moves. Seems he's playing chess while his enemies are playing hardball. There was breakdancing as an actual Olympic sport. The end. Speaking of sports, the much ballyhooed debut of Caitlyn Collins into the WNBA came and went. The same mostly white male commentators who have been lambasting even the idea of women in sports and attacking Title IX, suddenly they became cheerleaders for this one female athlete because she's white in a predominantly black sport. That's what she represents to them. Angel Reese was the one who actually got the college championship, not Caitlyn Clark, but it's what Caitlyn represents to them, at least in the moment that matters. She's a convenient sock puppet. Her accomplishments and her ability are meaningless. So she came, she saw, she flopped. She lost her debut game and her team, the Indiana Fever, was out in September, so their season ended early. She was given some kind of all-star title, which is just white power showing that it can give phony credentials to someone. They can make up phony awards and phony stats and then claim that their handpicked puppet is the best because of these artificial accolades they hand to them. So sports' great white hope turned out to be the great white hype, and while I don't necessarily heap scorn on Caitlyn Clark, I don't know her well enough to praise or condemn her. I would say it's very interesting how the same chumps who attacked Serena Williams for being masculine have had conveniently nothing to say about the very tomboyish-looking Caitlyn Clark. I guess their brains and their eyes don't work so well. Officer Eric Adams of the NYPD was indicted by the feds for taking money from foreign nationals. After running for office on a platform of lecturing black people, those same white benefactors are now showing Officer Adams how much they respect him, which is not at all. So this is why he was so eager to stand right behind CEO killer Luigi Mangione when he was brought back to New York. I guess Officer Eric Adams is doing a rehearsal for his own perp walk. Personally, I think orange would be flattering on him, but that's just me. Fat Joe finally couldn't hold in his contempt for black Americans any longer, so Fat Joe ran his fat mouth, and he's been getting lit up. I haven't said anything about it because everyone else is giving that bloated bigot the business, so there's not much for me to add. This is yet another example of why the Black-Brown Alliance was DOA. It never existed, nor could it. When we talk about immigrants who come here from countries whose culture is based in anti-black racism, Fat Joe is an avatar for exactly what we're talking about. Another example of people who needed our help to get here and who would have had no rights or opportunities without us. There's a reason why there were no Asian American or Hispanic American millionaires of any note before we made that possible in the 20th century. So I hope that black people understand that it matters who they spend their money on, and why I'm so sour on so-called entertainment and the people in it, because this is who's in it. Because Fat Joe is not alone in his anti-black racism. He was just one of the few who couldn't contain his bigotry any longer. He's had this contempt for us from day one, because he would never have been able to be successful like this in Puerto Rico or anywhere else. He had to come here. And that eats him alive. He's a culture vulture who has been eating, no pun intended, off our culture for decades. Culture vultures like him could never have made it on their own. He saw how we took a stand for ours, and he needed us to be successful, and that makes him feel insecure because it reminds him he is a failure who comes from failure. Rather than be respectful of the people who made it possible for a big fat failure like him to be something other than a big fat failure, instead he does what so many others have done. Disrespect us because when they look in the mirror, they see someone who could never have done what we did. Fat Joe is an anti-black racist and always has been. And I think those are the words that describe him best. Has been. The rise and fall of Kamala Harris in 2020 has now been followed by another rise and predictable fall in 2024. I had written Kamala Harris off as political dead meat long ago, telling everyone her presidential dreams were deader than Trotsky. But when Biden chose her for his running mate, the DNC's online shills and other assorted idiots were celebrating. Professor Truth, see you wrong, they said. He don't know what he talking about. Kamala's on her way to being the first female president. These shills thought that this was going to be her political coming out party. Instead, they largely kept Kamala Harris in the basement as vice president. Her communications office should have been called the miscommunications office because she was constantly having to walk back every stupid word that she said. She was supposed to be the border czar, but that was more of an embarrassment than anything else. They didn't let her do many interviews because every time she did, she fell on her face. Since at least last February, long before even Biden had announced his re-election campaign getting underway, the left corner of the white media had already begun the usual phony, breathless cheerleading for her. CNN crowed that Kamala was the Democrats' best weapon for 2024. This was in February, mind you, 6 months before she made her lunk-headed damned-to-fail foray into the presidential campaign. The white media merely copied and pasted all their fawning headlines that they had run about Hillary's campaign back in 2016. They copied it word for word. Everything from setting campaign fundraising records to she's got all these celebrities endorsing her. Kamala's campaign had so many celebrities, I didn't know if she was running for president or for the Grammys, Emmys, and the Tonys. And apparently, her voters didn't know what she was running for either because she lost every single battleground state. Her political implosion defied all the so-called experts who were experts in nothing. The so-called formulas and old wives' tales and wishful thinking they used simply couldn't trump reality. See what I did there? As Election Day came, the white media talked about record-setting early voting, which usually favors Democrats. But as I explained in my post-election postmortem, the numbers were actually down for that, not up. The white media used a ton of weasel words to create the misimpression that Kamala was prompting massive voter turnout, when in reality, voters were actually turned off. The white media creates bubbles for itself, and then carpet bombs the public with their narratives. Most people are conformists, sheep, so this kind of mass mind control does work more often than not. But its effectiveness is clearly beginning to decline. 4 years ago, Joe Scarborough said that Trump wasn't gone, but Trumpism was. And I'm watching this idiot and going, man, who actually listens to this moron? Neither the orange man nor the putrid ideology that he was fronting for were gone at all, and as we see, he made a comeback. What a surprise. Trump lost lawsuit after lawsuit. He was criminally convicted, not one but 2 assassination attempts, the left corner of the white media saying he was down in all the polls. But the orange man knew that the only poll that mattered was the one on Election Day. And by winning so resoundingly, he has a true mandate. His enemies spent years saying he was the second coming of Hitler. If he wins in 2024, that's going to be the end of the American experiment. And they put out an endless string of articles falsely claiming that Kamala Harris was ahead in this or that poll, or leading among this or that demo. And yet for all of these articles and these white media front pieces claiming that Kamala Harris was leading in this or that sliver of the population, none of them would boldly proclaim that she would definitely win. So the polls they put out there were actually meant to influence public opinion, but it didn't work. And now you've got those same white left media outlets who were lambasting the orange man for years, now bending the knee to him. Mika and Joe Brzezinski were the first, but not the last. The white men who own and run these white media companies are doing what they did in 2016, the first time he won. They're toning down the rhetoric and trying to see how they can finesse some favorable terms for themselves from Trump's FCC. People wonder why Jeff Bezos, who owns the Washington Post, has been cozying up to Trump. Well, he's not alone. A number of white media outlet managers have been changing their tune since he won. In fact, they started changing it when it became more obvious to them that he was going to win. This is why I keep telling you not to put too much stock into the occasional shouting matches that white power has amongst themselves. Because when push comes to shove, white power knows how to put their squabbles aside in furtherance of their own power. And to be bluntly honest, that's a lesson black people could stand to learn from. Now, when it comes to these year-in-review lists, there's a lot of people who are very fond of talking about who's the biggest loser for the year, for the week, for the month, or whatever, and who's the biggest winner. I'm not fond of that, but in this case, I'll go ahead and play along. The biggest loser for the year have to be the bootlicks. These meat puppets for the Democrats and the Republicans, though mostly the bootlicks for the Democrats because nobody listens to the 2 or 3 professional butt kissers who the GOP has on the payroll, these guys have been exposed as useless and worthless. Roly-Poly Martin's been feverishly trying to sell himself as some sort of Negro whisperer as he pathetically chases after that ever-elusive DNC consulting gig he's been trying to get for so many years. From Angela Rye, with lettuce and tomatoes on the side, to Tiffany Cross-Eyes, to Mark Lamont Schill, to whomever, there's been a flood of cable news cast-offs all desperately trying to reinvent themselves in the online space. Angela Rye was on the Breakfast Schlubs and clearly was auditioning to see if there were any make-work token positions left in Kamala's campaign, so she attacked Jill Stein live on air. And her own viewers tore her up for it. Now you know you're irrelevant when you're on what's supposed to be your show and you attack someone and your own viewers take the other person's side. It's as I've always told you, the white media can give you a platform, but they can't give you legitimacy. That's what happened this year. The village idiots were exposed, not only for the money the Democrats who their slaves to gave them, but also exposed as being totally useless to the Democrat paymasters they work for. This year, black self-advocacy from the grassroots has been on the march in a big way, and as a result, we've had the bootlicks on air and online, leading attack after attack on the black media this election cycle. They pulled out all the stops to try to delegitimize us. But the under 50 crowd paid them no never mind. Their phony pretend credibility was on the line, and they failed resoundingly. They're shills, which is bad enough, but what's worse is they're worthless shills. For the bootlicks, this is an existential crisis, because as we all know, when white supremacy is done with its tools, it breaks its tools. The longer these shills are exposed as useless, white power is going to begin dumping them. And for the shills, there is no plan B. Simone Mamie Sanders gave them all false hope. They all now desperately hope that they could follow in her footsteps, shamelessly lie for some Democrat presidential campaign, and then get yourself some job in the basement of the White House, and then you get to lie and claim it was an important job, and I know so much about how Washington works because I was in the White House basement for 11 months. That's Simone Sanders' actual story. She didn't even last a year in the Biden administration. And afterwards, you can go ahead and use your blink and you'll miss it moment in the White House as a resume enhancer and finesse yourself a white media gig full-time. At least, that's what the bootlicks have been hoping for, but it turns out that the white media has a strict policy, one bootlick at a time. But by far, the most significant event of 2024 isn't the orange man returning to the White House. That's noteworthy, but not the most important. The most significant event of the year has to be how black activists in California forced reparations into the political discourse out there and directly confronted the black misleadership class. And of course, black voters standing on business on election day, punishing Kamala the cop for her 3+ decades of using every political position she's ever held to attack us, and to send Jim Crow Joe out the door in disgrace, though his mind is so far gone at this point he probably doesn't even know what's happened, or that he even had the presidency to begin with. This year was the first major test for black political resolve. The next major step is going to test our persistence. We have to start getting people into political office. I've been saying that for years, but that comes next. There's no way around it. That's going to take mobilizing and strategizing. Delegitimizing these tools, shills, and bootlicks is the first major step, but it cannot be the last. Now, we're not ones to sit around patting ourselves on the back, but it is good for us to take stock of where we've been, and more importantly, ask ourselves, have we made progress? And we have. And that being the case, we have to make sure that we stay the course. So for my part, I'm going to go ahead and stop my recap of the year in review there. There's plenty more moments and events from the year to be mentioned, obviously, so feel free to mention them in the comments section. But understand something. This is war, and in war you have both advances and setbacks, but no defeats unless you surrender, and you have no victories until you win. We're in this for the long haul, and I know it won't be easy, but it will be worth it. So we're looking forward to 2025 as the war on white supremacy continues. The calendar may change, but our agenda will not. Good evening, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. BC, Benson Menento, Dia Williams, Black Truth United, and Pamela Hyman. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.